Agatha Raisin and the Murder at Plover Hall. Good evening and welcome, dear friends. Before Agatha steps into today's mystery, we'd love to hear from you. Tell us in the comments, where in the world are you listening from tonight? It warms our hearts knowing how far Agatha's little adventures travel. Your comments truly keep this cozy corner alive. And if these stories bring you comfort, do subscribe so you never miss a moment. So, let's begin. Chapter 1. Frost, Facades, and Hidden Smiles. The winding country lanes stretched before Agatha like ribbons of frost-stiffened velvet, their edges frosted silver in the early morning light. She maneuvered her car with deliberate care, every curve of the road bringing her closer to Plover Hall, whose grandeur loomed faintly through the mist. The estate's stone walls rose from snow-dusted gardens, trimmed hedges standing like sentinels, and ornate gates glimmered as though dusted with powdered sugar. Agatha could not help but admire the sheer elegance of it all, the way the morning sun turned frost into tiny flashes of brilliance, the way the old oaks seemed to salute her arrival. She tugged her gloves a little tighter, a shiver not entirely due to cold tracing down her spine. Guests were beginning to arrive, each a study in cultivated composure. Women in fur-trimmed coats and silk scarves stepped daintily from carriages, their smiles impeccable yet just slightly strained. Men adjusted cravats with hurried fingers, murmuring polite greetings that carried the faintest undertone of impatience. Agatha's eyes caught the small details she relished. A young woman with hair the color of autumn leaves laughed too loudly, her eyes darting towards another guest whose lips pressed into a thin line, almost impatient. Across the drive, a man in a deep navy coat appeared to hesitate, his hand hovering over the latch of a carriage door, as though uncertain whom to approach. Agatha's sharp intuition tickled her awareness of invisible currents, the subtle power plays, the quiet jealousies, the unspoken rivalries. A carriage door slammed, breaking her reverie, and she glimpsed a stranger alight, a figure draped in a dark cloak with a bearing that suggested discretion but demanded attention. He carried no visible luggage, only a rolled envelope clutched carefully in gloved hands. Agatha's curiosity flared instantly, a flicker of excitement mingled with apprehension. Who was he, and why did he arrive in such quiet determination while the rest of the guests performed their intricate dance of social etiquette? Her mind began cataloging possibilities, hypothesizing connections, and assessing potential risks, all while maintaining the outward calm she had perfected over years of navigating similar estates and gatherings. She inhaled the crisp air, tasting hints of pine, frost, and something indefinably sharp in the atmosphere. The estate, with its perfect lawns and grand facades, hid far more than it revealed, and Agatha could sense it in the shuffle of servants, the careful avoidance of eye contact, and the faint tremor in a guest's handshake. The day had begun with calm, but like the slow rise of steam over a simmering kettle, the tensions were ready to escape. Plover Hall was alive with whispers of secrets, and Agatha was already leaning in to listen. The afternoon sunlight poured through tall, mullioned windows, casting elongated patterns across the polished floors of Plover Hall's drawing room. Agatha settled into a high-backed chair, delicate china teacup balanced carefully in her gloved hands. The room smelled faintly of bergamot and polished wood, mingling with the distant aroma of fresh scones still warm from the kitchen. Guests murmured softly among themselves, their conversations polite but laden with subtle tension. Every laugh seemed slightly too high, every nod a little too eager. Agatha sipped her tea, noting the way it barely scalded her tongue, a small comfort in an otherwise meticulous environment. It was then that she noticed it. A pale cream envelope neatly slid under the door, its edges just peeking into the room. For a moment she hesitated, letting the casual murmur of voices continue around her, gauging whether anyone else had noticed the intrusion. No one had. The envelope rested innocuously on the carpet, almost inviting discovery, yet impossible to ignore. Agatha's curiosity, always a potent mix of caution and delight, flickered like a candle flame. She picked it up carefully, feeling the unusual weight of its contents and noting the faint scent of something metallic, faint but deliberate, almost like iron from a pin. She extracted the letter and unfolded it slowly, her eyes scanning the elegant but unmistakably urgent handwriting. There was no signature, no indication of sender, just a single message, a cryptic warning pointing to a location within Plover Hall itself. Agatha's pulse quickened, a small thrilling flutter that her instincts immediately recognized as a call to action. This was no idle note. Something significant, possibly dangerous, awaited someone who dared follow the clue. She glanced around, masking the excitement with a practiced calm. No one else seemed aware of it, their conversations and smiles continuing as though the envelope did not exist. Agatha's mind began cataloging possibilities with her usual efficiency. Who might send such a note? Why leave it unsigned? And what secret could be so precarious that it demanded discretion rather than confrontation? Her gaze swept over the assembled guests. There, a lady nervously brushed her sleeve against her lap, fingers twitching, avoiding eye contact. Across the room, a gentleman's knee bounced ever so slightly beneath his trousers, betraying impatience or anxiety. Another guest laughed softly at a remark, the sound a little too forced, as though hiding an awareness of events beyond casual tea conversation. Every subtle movement was a clue, every imperfection in their composure a potential lead. The envelope's presence cast a delicate shadow over the room's otherwise pristine social harmony. Whispered speculations began to circulate, though none directly addressed the note. Agatha noted how easily fear and curiosity could mingle with polite society, and how quickly subtle tensions could become audible. Her own mind danced between observation and imagination, weaving scenarios, testing theories, and tracing invisible threads that might connect guest to mystery. Every glance she exchanged with the staff hinted at their awareness too, though their professionalism kept any panic carefully contained. After another sip of tea, Agatha set the cup down with measured precision. She could not ignore the note, nor the peculiar way its delivery had avoided notice. She considered her next steps, balancing discretion with urgency. Every instinct screamed that the envelope was a key, a small but vital puzzle piece, and that the moment for careful observation had begun. Plover Hall, she realized, was no longer just a stately backdrop. It had become a stage for secrets, whispers, and hidden intentions. And she, as always, was at the center of its unfolding drama. Chapter 2. Secrets in the Snow. The first hints of dusk settled over Plover Hall, painting the frost-laden gardens in a soft, silvery glow. Lanterns flickered to life along winding paths, their warm light spilling over snow-dusted hedges and illuminating frozen rose bushes with delicate precision. Agatha pulled her scarf tighter around her neck, the chill sharp but invigorating, and stepped onto the gravel walk that led toward the far edge of the ground. Each crunch of her boots on frost-bitten gravel echoed softly, a solitary rhythm against the quiet murmur of the estate preparing for evening. The winter air smelled faintly of pine, smoke from distant chimneys, and the subtle tang of cold iron in the frost. She moved deliberately, scanning the windows of Plover Hall as she walked. Behind one, a whispered argument fluttered like a trapped bird, voices low but tense enough to carry. Agatha caught fragments, "cannot possibly expect," and "after everything that happened," before the tones were cut off, replaced by forced laughter that attempted to smooth over the strain. She tucked the invisible thread of overheard words into the mental file she always kept, a growing map of tension that would prove useful later. A sense of intrigue prickled at her, a mixture of caution and anticipation she could not resist. A sudden movement near the hedge drew her gaze. Something dark flitted across the snow, elongated by lantern light into an almost grotesque shadow. Agatha's eyes narrowed, following its path carefully. It darted behind a cluster of topiary, only to re-emerge closer to the hall itself. Whoever or whatever it was, they moved deliberately, aware of the visibility, yet unafraid. Her mind ticked over the possibilities, weighing mischief against malice, and noting subtle signs of intention hidden beneath motion. Every shadow had a story, and some could be more dangerous than the flickering glow of lantern light suggested. Her attention shifted again as a small handkerchief fluttered past her boots, snagged briefly on a bush before coming to rest in the snow. Agatha bent to retrieve it, noting the embroidery. Initials stitched with careful, precise lettering. She pocketed it, aware that such an innocuous object could be a thread linking someone to events inside the hall. The juxtaposition of delicate, peaceful winter scenery against these tiny but telling disruptions made her chest tighten slightly, a sense of foreboding she could neither ignore nor dismiss. From the corner of her eye, she noticed silhouettes moving behind more windows. A figure seemed to pace a room near the library, hands clenching and unclenching, their posture taut with concern or impatience. Another leaned casually against a doorframe, but Agatha's keen observation caught a brief tremor of the shoulder, betraying anxiety beneath the composed exterior. Each window became a lens into hidden worlds, where politeness barely concealed simmering unease. The winter evening was serene, yet the estate's quiet corners were alive with secrets, tiny disturbances that whispered possibilities to anyone paying attention. Agatha inhaled the crisp air, exhaling slowly, letting her senses absorb both beauty and tension simultaneously. Every flicker of light, every muffled voice, every shadow cast upon snow was a potential clue, an invisible line connecting intention to consequence. She made careful mental notes, cataloging the evening's details, the argument, the discarded handkerchief, the restless shadows, and the subtle signs of unrest in windows both near and far. There was danger here, quiet yet insistent, simmering beneath Plover Hall's winter serenity, and she alone seemed aware of it. As she turned back toward the hall, her boots crunching softly, Agatha allowed herself a small, private smile. The estate's outward perfection was a mask, and behind it, intrigue stirred. She would watch, wait, and gather, as the evening's whispers promised revelations only the observant could uncover. The quiet of Plover Hall's winter evening shattered with a piercing scream that seemed to claw its way through the halls. Agatha's teacup slipped unnoticed from a nearby tray, crashing against the polished floor with a sharp, ringing clatter. She sprang to her feet, her instincts firing faster than her heartbeat, and sprinted toward the source, her boots crunching on frost-laced gravel just beyond the open windows. The echo of panic mingled with the distant murmur of lanterns swinging in the evening breeze, lending an eerie rhythm to the estate's sudden chaos. She reached the library door to find it ajar, the warm light inside flickering against rows of leather-bound volumes. Her eyes fell on the scene. A man lay sprawled across the oriental rug, his chest pierced by a gleaming antique dagger that protruded at a cruel angle. The handle was ornate, carved with curling patterns that seemed almost to mock the horror of the moment. Agatha inhaled sharply, noting the unusual craftsmanship and the weight of the object. It was not a common household knife. The victim's eyes were wide open, staring at nothing, frozen mid-expression, while the room reeked faintly of iron and polished wood. Around her, the guests had begun to gather, murmuring and pointing in panicked disbelief. Some pressed trembling hands to their mouths, unable to voice coherent questions. Others forced themselves into composure, their polite facades cracking only slightly. Agatha's attention, however, was fully occupied with observation. She catalogued each reaction with the precision of a seasoned detective. A lady in violet gloves clutched her pearl necklace as if it were a talisman against shock, while a gentleman in a green scarf leaned casually against a bookshelf, his composure unnaturally rigid, eyes darting quickly from guest to guest. These reactions, she noted, could speak as loudly as words if one only listened carefully. Kneeling briefly to examine the dagger without touching it, Agatha traced the intricate carvings with her gaze. The weapon was ceremonial in appearance, more suited to display than use, yet it had found its mark. She considered how it might have been obtained, who among the guests had knowledge of its existence, and who could have handled it without leaving telltale marks. Her mind raced through possibilities, mentally reconstructing the timeline, arrivals, movements, conversations, and the exact moments when each guest was accounted for. Small inconsistencies flickered like shadows at the edges of her memory, details that might have seemed trivial to others, but were critical to her methodical reasoning. Footsteps approached, soft but insistent, and she glanced upward to see the staff exchanging worried glances, their usual efficiency replaced by whispered questions and cautious gestures. Agatha remained calm, focusing on what she could see rather than the rise in hysteria around her. Every twitch, glance, and cough was a potential clue, each adding another thread to the intricate tapestry of the evening's mystery. She noted who had been closest to the library before the scream, who had no clear explanation for their whereabouts, and which interactions carried subtle signs of tension or avoidance. As the crowd thickened, a low murmur of speculation rippled through the library. Agatha's lips pressed together. Panic could cloud judgment, but she relied on quiet observation, letting the room reveal its secrets. The dagger, the placement of the body, the minute gestures of those around her, all these elements combined into a puzzle only a careful mind could begin to assemble. Plover Hall, so serene only moments before, had transformed into a stage of fear, intrigue, and danger, and Agatha, as always, was determined to see every thread of the story through. Chapter 3. Gathering Storms. Agatha stood near the grand staircase, her hands folded over her coat, and watched the guests cluster awkwardly in small groups. She began her inquiries with a soft, unassuming approach, sidling up to a middle-aged man with a thinning mustache who appeared far too calm for the situation. "Mr. Harrington," she said, tilting her head with polite curiosity, "I wonder if you might recall where you were during the unfortunate incident in the library." His mustache twitched nervously, and he cleared his throat as though the effort might expel more than just words. I was in the conservatory," he stammered, glancing sideways at the chandelier, as if its crystal drops might offer him protection. "Looking at the plants. Yes, quite, observing the ferns." He shifted on his feet, a little too deliberately, and Agatha's eyes flicked to the small smudge of soil on his cuff. Observant as ever, she made a mental note. Soil on a coat in winter? Curious. Next, she approached a young lady draped in lilac silk, who clutched her purse like a lifeline. "Miss Blythe, did you see anything unusual this afternoon?" Agatha asked casually, her tone mild, almost conversational. The girl's hands fluttered as if attempting to smooth out the panic on her lap. "Well, I was fetching my gloves from the billiard room, and then I thought I heard a sort of scuffle, or perhaps it was the wind." Her voice quavered, high and delicate, and she avoided Agatha's eyes. Agatha noted the subtle tremor in the girl's fingers, the rapid intake of breath. The inconsistencies were small, but telling. Tiny fractures in an otherwise polished performance. Across the room, a portly gentleman in a green coat fumbled with a handkerchief, dropping it twice before managing a forced bow. I was in the drawing room, counting books," he said, his gaze dart toward a shelf as though it might confirm his claim. Agatha suppressed a smile at the absurdity. The room held perhaps 100 books, yet he pretended the meticulous accounting mattered. She added his words and movements to her growing mental map of guest behaviors, amused by the comedic edge of human anxiety, even as the stakes remained grave. Agatha moved from guest to guest, each interaction revealing subtle contradictions, nervous tics, or faint admissions tucked between polite phrases. One woman admitted she had been in the corridor near the library, but claimed to have seen nothing. Yet her fingernails bore faint traces of ink, perhaps from a note she hadn't intended to mention. Another gentleman insisted he had been reading in his room, but the angle of his gaze and the way he adjusted his cravat suggested he had overheard far more than he admitted. Each piece of information, no matter how small or humorous, threaded together into a web of potential connections. Throughout the questioning, Agatha's internal commentary flickered with dry amusement. She noted the eccentricities, squeaky shoes, uneven laughter, an unusually large cameo brooch, as if cataloging a gallery of human quirks for future reference. The guests' absurdities provided light relief, a counterpoint to the tension simmering beneath polite smiles. And yet, behind the humor, every movement, every hesitation, and every twitch offered a clue, a subtle fingerprint of truth or deception waiting to be discovered. By the time she stepped back to observe the room as a whole, Agatha's mind was alive with the interlocking threads of stories, gestures, and contradictions. The laughter and fumbling hands, the nervous glances and carefully phrased statements, all were part of a puzzle she was uniquely equipped to unravel. Each interaction had drawn her closer to understanding who was truthful, who was hiding, and which overlooked detail might yet unlock the next revelation. Plover Hall, once serene, now thrummed with hidden truths, and Agatha's curiosity and humor guided her effortlessly through the storm of human eccentricity. Agatha's curiosity tugged her deeper into Plover Hall, beyond the gilded drawing rooms and polished corridors that greeted most visitors. Her steps were quiet, deliberate, as she traced the perimeter of the library, her eyes scanning walls, moldings, and the slightest irregularities in the ornate paneling. She had learned over years of investigation that the most unassuming corners often concealed the most consequential secrets, and her instincts hummed with a familiar excitement. Something about the library, beyond the immediate horror of the dagger, hinted at hidden infrastructure, spaces that had been intended for private use and careful concealment. A faint draft whispered along the edge of the bookcase near the eastern wall. Agatha crouched, inspecting the floorboards with practiced fingers, noting a subtle seam that disrupted the otherwise flawless wood. She pressed lightly against the panel, testing its weight and alignment. With a soft click, the section swung inward, revealing a narrow corridor concealed in shadow. Dust motes danced in the lantern glow, drifting along the corridor's length like tiny spectral guides. Agatha's heart quickened, not with fear, but with the thrill of discovery. This was a secret few would notice, and fewer still would have the audacity to traverse. Her boots stirred the dust as she stepped carefully along the corridor. The air was cooler here, tinged with the faint scent of old stone, iron, and something subtly metallic. Footprints marred the dust, shallow but distinct, as though someone had passed only moments before. Agatha's eyes narrowed. These tracks could belong to the perpetrator, or at least someone intimately involved in the unfolding mystery. She memorized each curve and irregularity, cataloging the direction and weight distribution. Someone had moved deliberately through this space, aware of its secrecy, perhaps using it as a hidden artery to navigate the estate unnoticed. The corridor twisted and narrowed, walls lined with rough stone that contrasted sharply with the ornate elegance elsewhere in the hall. Agatha imagined the possibilities: a murderer using the passage to avoid observation, a servant delivering illicit messages, or a guest with clandestine motives moving between rooms unseen. Each scenario expanded in her mind, a mental map of opportunity and risk. She traced potential routes, noting vantage points, exits, and weakly lit junctions that might conceal another figure. The architecture itself seemed to whisper, revealing more than mere design. It hinted at intentional concealment and the human dramas it had once sheltered. At the end of the passage, a low door led to the servant quarters. Agatha paused, noting its simple latch and the faint indentations on the floor where shoes had pressed into dust. The footprints continued beyond the door, implying recent traversal. Her mind raced, balancing questions of motive, access, and opportunity. Who had chosen to move through this hidden route? Was the dagger's placement in the library premeditated, facilitated by secret knowledge of these corridors? Each observation added weight to her growing theory that the murder was not impulsive, but carefully plotted. She backed out of the passage, leaving the door slightly ajar, as if it might serve as a lure for later investigation. Returning to the main corridor, Agatha catalogued her findings mentally, layering them over the statements, gestures, and oddities she had already observed among the guests. The interplay between architecture and human behavior fascinated her. The hall itself became a silent accomplice in intrigue, its hidden spaces offering concealment, escape, and opportunity. Pausing near the library door, Agatha allowed herself a small private smile. The hidden corridor was more than a passage. It was a puzzle piece, a key to understanding the carefully orchestrated chaos that had erupted within Plover Hall. The air of suspense, mingled with the thrill of discovery, left her invigorated. Every shadowed corner now seemed alive with possibility, every creak in the floorboards a potential signal. Whoever had walked here left traces, intentional or not, and Agatha was already following them in her mind, piecing together a map only she could read. Chapter 4. Web of Motives. Agatha settled into the corner of the drawing room, her notebook unopened but ready, eyes sweeping over the gathering of guests as though cataloging invisible threads connecting them all. She had learned that human relationships, far more than ornate architecture or polished floors, often held the key to understanding a mystery. With meticulous observation, she began to assemble mental maps: who liked whom, who resented whom, and which grudges might fester beneath polite smiles. The patterns were subtle, almost imperceptible, yet they spoke volumes to a trained eye. Her attention first fell on a pair of guests whose interactions carried barely concealed tension. Lady Harrington, her gloves white and spotless, lingered just a fraction too long near Mr. Blythe, whose posture radiated mild irritation. Agatha noted the slight narrowing of the lady's eyes when he spoke, the faint press of lips against a teacup rim, and the hand that flexed unconsciously in her lap. A rivalry, perhaps born of a social slight years ago, now played out under the guise of polite conversation. Agatha's mind ticked through possible triggers, cataloging how such a subtle animosity could escalate in the heat of crisis. Nearby, a younger woman with chestnut curls fidgeted with a lace handkerchief, dropping it repeatedly as she tried to arrange the seating at the long table. Agatha caught the initials embroidered in delicate thread, initials that matched a man in a dark coat seated across the room. The pair avoided direct eye contact, exchanging glances that were too brief, too calculated. Perhaps a romantic entanglement or a scandal yet undisclosed was simmering beneath the surface. Each detail, each dropped object became a breadcrumb leading toward deeper insight, and Agatha filed them away, conscious that even the smallest clue might reveal motive. A sudden cough drew her attention. Mr. Harrington coughed twice, unnaturally loud, a hand raised to his chest, as though the sound were a deliberate distraction. Agatha followed his gaze and noticed a missing cufflink on his left sleeve. Another small anomaly, seemingly trivial, yet perfectly aligned with the careful observations she'd been making. Who had removed it, and why? Could it be a sign of a struggle, a hurried exchange, or a subtle message left for those who knew to look? Each mystery layer fed into the growing web of intrigue she was constructing. Even the servants offered cues, though unspoken. One quietly replaced a vase that had been slightly askew, while another lingered near the door, watching guests with a faintly anxious expression. Their movements, while subtle, reinforced the notion that tension permeated every corner of Plover Hall. Agatha made mental notes. Who observed whom, who seemed too tense, who too casual, and who reacted in ways inconsistent with the gravity of the evening. Each observation was a thread in the intricate tapestry of motives, alliances, and rivalries. By the time she leaned back in her chair, Agatha had mentally catalogued disputes over deaths, social slights, and whispered rivalries. Some tensions were old, lingering like shadows in a forgotten corridor. Others were new, fresh enough to flare unexpectedly. The abandoned glove on the parquet floor, the missing cufflink, the nervous cough, and the fleeting glances all converged into a coherent pattern. She allowed herself a small, private smile. The social intricacies of Plover Hall were not merely decorative, they were potential weapons, and understanding them was the first step toward uncovering who stood to gain most from the night's deadly events. Agatha's gaze swept the room one final time, noting which rivalries could ignite next. Every guest held a secret, every object a story, and every glance a potential signal. In her mind, the threads began to form a complex web, intricate and delicate, connecting opportunity, motive, and suspicion. Plover Hall, serene at first glance, was a labyrinth of hidden intentions, and Agatha, as always, was prepared to navigate its winding corridors of human intrigue. Agatha moved quietly through the dimly lit study, the scent of aged paper and polished oak filling her senses. The room was lined with shelves of leather-bound volumes, their spines gleaming in the soft glow of a single desk lamp. As she approached the writing table, something caught her eye, a folded piece of parchment, partially hidden beneath a stack of ledgers. She picked it up carefully, feeling the crisp texture beneath her fingers, and unfolded it with deliberate precision. The handwriting was unfamiliar, elegant, and urgent, curling across the page like the script of a bygone era. The note referenced an incident decades past, a scandal that had been hushed over time, but evidently not forgotten. Mentions of a disputed inheritance, a secret liaison, and a betrayal carefully concealed were scrawled in careful, deliberate ink. Agatha's pulse quickened as she connected this to the current guests. Could one of them have been linked to the old controversy? Or was someone exploiting the forgotten scandal to mask more recent malice? Her mind immediately catalogued the possibilities, mentally cross-referencing names, past events, and the subtle rivalries she had already observed. She stepped closer to the mantelpiece, noticing the ornate carvings that had seemed purely decorative at first glance. Small symbols, almost imperceptible, were etched into the wood, a curling vine here, a tiny fleur-de-lis there, each slightly out of alignment with the pattern of the rest of the carvings. Agatha traced the shapes with her finger, realizing they formed a code, coordinates of sorts, or perhaps a sequence meant only for those who knew to look. The craftsmanship of the estate, the layers of history embedded in every corner, now revealed itself as both guide and warning. Her eyes scanned the room further, catching the faint glint of a hidden compartment behind the lower panel of the bookshelf. Inside, she found another note, shorter and even more cryptic, a date, a pair of initials, and a brief phrase that suggested urgency and danger. Agatha's detective mind began piecing together a timeline, imagining which guests might have knowledge of these secrets and which could have had motive to act on them. Every hidden symbol, every carefully placed note added layers of complexity, teasing her intellect and heightening the tension. She paused to consider the implications. If these notes were connected to the murder, they suggested forethought and deliberate planning. The dagger in the library, the movements through the hidden corridor, and now the encoded messages pointed toward a killer who understood the hall's architecture and history intimately. Agatha's gaze swept the study, imagining every possible path through the estate, every vantage point from which secrets could be observed, and every guest who could exploit such knowledge. Her mind raced with the possibilities, yet her composure remained intact. A flicker of shadow moved outside the window, briefly reflected in the polished surface of a framed portrait. Agatha stiffened, noting the angle and the timing. Someone was observing, or perhaps moving with intent. The sense of immediate danger mingled with intellectual thrill. The old scandal, hidden codes, and deliberate secrecy coalesced into a puzzle demanding both speed and caution. She tucked the notes into her pocket, deciding to return later for a more thorough examination. But she kept her eyes open, aware that discovery by the wrong person could have dire consequences. Stepping back from the desk, Agatha allowed herself a small, private smile. The layers of history, secrecy, and cunning embedded within Plover Hall promised a challenge worthy of her skills. Every clue pointed to a story that bridged past and present, motive and opportunity, and as she glanced around the study one last time, she silently promised herself she would decode the secrets before another tragedy struck, guided by her wit, observation, and an unshakable curiosity that had never failed her.
Chapter 6. Missteps and Misleading Trails. Agatha moved briskly through the upper corridors of Plover Hall, her notebook in one hand and a pen poised for meticulous observation. The evening had delivered a cascade of confusing reports, each seeming more credible than the last, and her mind danced between clues, contradictions, and instinct. A faint sense of amusement threaded through her anxiety. After all, a mystery was never complete without a few missteps along the way. First came Mr. Harrington, who insisted he had been polishing the silver in the dining hall at the exact moment of the library murder. Agatha noted the shine on the trays and cutlery, far too polished for such haste, and his insistence felt performative. A subtle smirk tregged at the corner of her lips.
Convenient, she murmured under her breath, filing it under potential distraction rather than truth. Next, she confronted Miss Blythe, who had been seen hovering near the secret corridor. "I was arranging the cushions in the east wing," the girl said, her fingers twitching nervously. Agatha's gaze fell on the slight smudge of dust on her gloves. It contradicted her story, yet not decisively. Could it indicate a misstep in timing, or merely clumsiness? The line between accident and intent blurred, and Agatha had to rely on more than appearances. A low, wheezy cough drew her attention to the gentleman in the green coat, who claimed he had been counting books in the drawing-room. Agatha arched an eyebrow. The books were neatly aligned, not a single spine disturbed. Yet when she questioned him further, he stammered over times and locations, each sentence contradicting the last. The comedy of his flustered attempts was not lost on her. She suppressed a small chuckle, aware that humor often softened the tension for the observer, even when stakes were high. Meanwhile, the servants added their own twists. One insisted they had not left the kitchen, yet traces of fresh footprints led toward the library. Another claimed to have been delivering candles, but their hands bore traces of flour from the pantry. Agatha catalogued each detail with quiet efficiency, appreciating the way minor inconsistencies could mislead even the sharpest eye. Each misdirecting piece became another puzzle to navigate, a test of patience, wit, and attention to nuance. Despite the confusion, Agatha remained composed, allowing her mind to consider every angle. Each red herring provided insight, however indirect, into the habits, fears, and tendencies of those around her. The inconsistencies, when layered together, began to form patterns that might eventually reveal the truth. She took a moment to lean against the railing of the staircase, observing the subtle interplay of anxiety, defensiveness, and inadvertent humor in the guests' faces. She allowed herself a brief smile. The false leads were less obstacles than opportunities. The tangled threads of misinformation sharpened her focus, honed her attention, and reminded her that in Plover Hall, appearances were rarely reliable. Every mistaken assumption, every contradiction, and every comical misstep edged her closer to understanding who among the guests was manipulating perception, and which lead would finally point toward the real culprit. Moonlight spilled through the tall windows of Plover Hall, painting the corridors in silvery light that glimmered off polished floors. Agatha crouched near the corner of a hallway, her breath steady, ears straining for even the faintest sound. The estate had fallen into near silence, the usual evening bustle replaced by the delicate hum of night, the crackle of the fire in the drawing-room, the distant clink of a door latch, and the soft whisper of wind through frosted panes. She adjusted the edge of her coat, ensuring it did not rustle as she observed. Her sharp eyes caught movement, a shadow slipping along the far wall, too deliberate to be a trick of the light. A guest, or perhaps a servant, moved with purpose, glancing over their shoulder as if checking for witnesses. Agatha noted the posture, the cautious footstalls, the way hands hovered near pockets and cuffs. Even the smallest gestures could betray intention, and in this muted hour, details became amplified, each telling a story the untrained eye might miss. A quiet scuffle echoed from the eastern wing. Agatha froze, listening. Footsteps paused, then resumed in irregular rhythm. Someone had dropped an object, a faint metallic tinkle that resonated briefly in the otherwise still hall. Her pulse quickened. Each sound, each flicker of shadow was another piece of the evening's puzzle. Was it the murderer, or simply a guest uneasy with the night? She catalogued possibilities silently, letting the tension sharpen her focus rather than overwhelm it. Near the grand staircase, another figure emerged from a side door. Agatha's eyes tracked the movement carefully. The person paused, glanced around the empty corridor, and then continued down a hallway toward the library. She memorized every detail: coat length, gait, hesitation at doorways, even the angle of a turned head. Small, seemingly innocuous actions, the lingering glance, the adjusted scarf, the slight shuffle of shoes, revealed more than words ever could. In the quiet of the night, truth was spoken through motion and shadow.
Agatha noted patterns in behavior, drawing invisible lines across the moonlit hallways, mapping who moved where and when. She realized that certain movements repeated, subtle but consistent. A figure who lingered near the study, another who circled the library, and a set of footprints that suggested a brief meeting in a corridor no one else should have known existed. Each observation layered suspicion, giving shape to an invisible web of intentions and opportunity. Finally, she stepped back into a shadowed alcove, allowing herself a slow, deliberate breath. The hall, tranquil by day, had transformed into a stage of quiet intrigue. Every creak, every shadow, every carefully measured movement whispered secrets to the patient observer. Agatha's notebook remained tucked safely in her coat, yet the mental map she had sketched was vivid. Hidden intentions, clandestine journeys, and the threads of possible complicity woven through the night. She smiled faintly, a mixture of satisfaction and anticipation. These nocturnal observations would inform her next moves, guiding her through the subtleties of motive and opportunity. Whoever moved in the moonlight had left a story written not in words, but in gestures, shadows, and fleeting sounds, and Agatha intended to read it in full.
The grand hall of Plover Hall was bathed in the warm glow of evening lanterns, their light flickering against the polished oak floors. Agatha stood near the center, notebook tucked under one arm, eyes scanning the gathered guests. She had assembled everyone, her mind a web of observations, motives, and subtle clues. The air was thick with anticipation. Even the servants, quietly stationed near doorways, seemed to sense that the evening's delicate equilibrium was about to fracture. Agatha's gaze settled on a solitary figure near the far end of the hall, Mr. Harrington. The slight tremor in his hands, the too perfect composure, and the earlier inconsistencies all aligned with the puzzle pieces she had carefully laid out. "Mr. Harrington," she began, her tone calm yet pointed, "you've been remarkably busy tonight, moving through corridors and avoiding conversation. One might almost think you were orchestrating events rather than simply attending them." She allowed the words to linger, watching for the telltale signs of guilt. A flicker of unease passed over his face, almost imperceptible, yet enough to confirm her suspicions. Agatha's internal smirk surfaced. Her deductions had brought her this far, but she knew the final revelation required finesse. "And what of the secret passage connecting the library to the servants' quarters?" she continued, voice sweetly conversational, almost teasing. A clever feature, though clearly one used for purposes not documented in any household manual. Harrington's lips pressed into a thin line. He attempted a hasty denial, but the words stumbled, tripping over their own weight. Agatha stepped closer, lightly tapping the notebook she held, the subtle sound echoing in the cavernous hall. "It seems you underestimated the keen eyes observing your creative movements. The dagger in the library, the cryptic notes, and the well-timed disappearances of certain individuals all point to a carefully plotted scheme. And yet, every scheme has a flaw." For a heartbeat, the room held its collective breath. Then Harrington's shoulders slumped, the carefully constructed mask of civility giving way to exasperation. I didn't mean for anyone to get hurt," he confessed, voice quivering but audible across the hall. Agatha's eyes softened just enough to allow a glimmer of humanity into the scene. "Intentions and outcomes are not always the same," she observed lightly, her tone carrying that signature blend of wit and authority. As the confession continued, subtle comedic exchanges emerged. Guests muttered observations about Harrington's dramatic flair, while Agatha interjected a few sharp, playful remarks about his misguided theatrics. The tension, once taut and almost unbearable, began to ease under her deft narrative touch. She highlighted inconsistencies with a gentle irony that drew murmurs of amusement, maintaining engagement without sacrificing the gravity of the revelation. By the time the confession concluded, the web of motives, secret passages, and hidden resentments had been untangled. Agatha's deductive prowess had not only exposed the murderer, but also illuminated the intricate social dynamics that had allowed the crime to occur. The hall, once simmering with suspense and anxiety, now felt cozy again, its wintry charm restored, yet enriched with the satisfaction of a mystery elegantly resolved.
Chapter 7. The Unmasking. The dining room of Plover Hall gleamed under the glow of chandeliers, silverware polished to a mirror finish and crystal glasses catching the flicker of candlelight. Agatha sat quietly at the head of the table, her notebook discreetly tucked under the folds of her coat. Tonight, she decided, the pieces would come together, or they would scatter further into confusion. She surveyed the assembled guests, noting posture, expressions, and the subtle shifts of unease that betrayed more than words ever could. Forks scraped plates, and soft murmurs floated over the warm glow of roasted meats and rich sauces. Yet every gesture, every glance, was loaded with meaning. Lady Harrington dabbed her lips with a napkin too quickly, while Mr. Blythe's hand trembled as he reached for his wine. Agatha catalogued each movement, comparing them against the mental map of behaviors, alibis, and nighttime observations she had been compiling since the murder. Each twitch, hesitation, and whispered apology formed part of an intricate web that demanded scrutiny. She leaned slightly forward, speaking softly but deliberately. It's remarkable how easily a misunderstanding can cascade into something more dangerous, she said, her voice measured, eyes flicking towards several guests in turn. A flicker of recognition, or was it guilt, passed over one face. Agatha made a mental note, testing the waters. Her words were casual, almost conversational, yet she observed the ripples they created. The slightest stiffening of a shoulder, a tightened jaw, or a delayed sip of wine could betray more than speech ever might. Between courses, Agatha allowed herself to compare notes mentally. The cryptic messages, the hidden corridor, the misplaced cufflink, the nervous glances and furtive movements. The inconsistencies lined up like pins on a map, highlighting pathways of access, opportunity, and motive. Each guest's story, once isolated, now intersected in ways that revealed tension points, potential triggers, and subtle contradictions. She noted which interactions had occurred near the library, which coincided with the servant's disappearance, and which aligned with movements she had observed under moonlight. A servant approached, refilling water, and Agatha's eyes followed the motion carefully. She noticed the way certain guests reacted, the slight anticipation or relief, as if their own actions had been under scrutiny. These small, seemingly mundane reactions provided more information than long-winded explanations ever could. Agatha's mind raced, connecting dots, testing theories, and predicting reactions before they occurred. By the time dessert was served, Agatha had assembled the outline of the night's events in her mind. The dagger's placement, the secret passage's use, the conflicting alibis, and the hidden resentments resurfacing at dinner. The stage was set. Her approach was subtle, questions posed gently, comments laced with insight, glances that conveyed awareness. Each move was calculated to provoke small reactions, to reveal who among the assembled had something to fear, something to hide. The room's warmth contrasted sharply with the tension she felt simmering beneath polite conversation. Every subtle shift, every carefully measured pause carried weight. Agatha knew that the truth lay in the reactions, in the interplay of knowledge, fear, and intent. By observing with patience and precision, she could draw the guilty to the surface without revealing her own hand. The web of clues was nearly complete, and she, with quiet satisfaction, sensed that the night's revelations were only moments away.
Chapter 8. Resolution and Reflection. The first rays of morning light fell gently across Plover Hall, turning the frost on the gardens into a delicate lattice of sparkling crystal. The estate, which had seemed so tense and watchful only hours before, now breathed a quiet calm. Agatha moved through the corridors, her footsteps light, observing the subtle signs of restoration. Curtains drawn neatly, chairs replaced to their accustomed angles, and the lingering scent of mulled wine fading into the crisp winter air. The hall had survived its night of drama, and it now looked almost serene, as though the previous evening's turmoil had been a fleeting shadow. Guests began to depart, exchanging farewells that were polite, yet tinged with lingering awe. Lady Harrington clutched her wrap, her cheeks flushed from the combination of cold and excitement. Mr. Blythe lingered near the door, glancing back at the hall as if reluctant to leave the quiet intensity behind. Each guest's expression carried a mixture of relief and curiosity, reflecting on their own roles in the night's events. Agatha watched, noting subtle signs of reactions, slight smiles, awkward coughs, and tentative laughter that hinted at the lingering tension dissolving into memory. She paused in the main hall, gathering her notes and observations from the previous days. The notebook, once a repository of mystery, now felt like a collection of triumphs, missteps, and humorous errors in judgment. Agatha allowed herself a quiet chuckle at some of her earlier assumptions. A flustered guest misread, a clue misinterpreted, and a misstep in her own deductions. It was comforting, in a way, to acknowledge human fallibility even amid detective brilliance. She scribbled the final notes with satisfaction, careful to preserve the meticulous record of the case while allowing space for reflection and humor. In the warmth of the drawing room, the hearth crackled gently, flames casting playful shadows across the polished floor. Agatha shared a quiet cup of tea with Hodge and Boswell, who regarded her knowingly, as though aware that their mistress had once again navigated chaos with wit and precision. The familiar companionship of their loyal allies grounded her, the weight of tension lifting in the company of those who offered steadfast comfort. Outside, the winter garden glimmered in the soft light, frost-laden branches reflecting the golden glow from the windows. The scene was peaceful, almost idyllic, a perfect counterpoint to the suspenseful night that had passed. As she sipped tea, Agatha considered the subtle consequences of the night's revelations. Relationships would shift, reputations would be quietly reassessed, and whispers of the hall's dramatic events would ripple through Carsely. Yet for now, all was orderly, and the estate had reclaimed its serene charm. She allowed herself a small, private smile, contemplating the mixture of relief, satisfaction, and gentle amusement that marked the end of another case. Plover Hall, resilient and stately, had endured, and Agatha, ever observant and ever curious, had restored balance, one careful observation at a time. The snow fell steadily outside Plover Hall, each flake drifting lazily onto the frost-laced gardens, transforming the landscape into a quiet, glimmering wonderland. Inside, Agatha sat near the hearth, the flames reflecting golden light on her thoughtful expression. The estate had settled into its post-crisis calm, and the guests had departed, leaving only the soft echo of footsteps and the occasional murmur of the wind outside. She cradled a steaming cup of tea, savoring the warmth that contrasted sharply with the crisp chill beyond the windows. A sharp knock at the door drew her attention. Startled but composed, Agatha rose and opened it to find a small envelope, elegantly sealed, resting on the doorstep. No one lingered nearby. No servant, no messenger. She picked it up with cautious curiosity, noting the delicate handwriting on the front. It was addressed simply, "For Miss Raisin, for eyes only." Her pulse quickened, an instinctive thrill stirring her senses. Even in the peaceful aftermath, Agatha could not resist the tug of mystery. Returning to her chair, she carefully broke the seal. Inside lay a single sheet of paper containing a brief, cryptic message. "The past is not as quiet as it seems. Shadows linger where you least expect them. Plover Hall was only the beginning." There were no signatures, no hints as to the sender. Agatha's eyebrows arched in delight. The writing was both elegant and slyly menacing, a playful taunt designed to provoke curiosity and caution in equal measure. She tapped the edge of the paper against her finger, pondering possibilities. Her mind immediately began racing through the potential implications. Was this the work of someone connected to the recent events, or an entirely new figure, unseen and clever? Could a minor clue she had overlooked resurface, demanding renewed attention? Agatha smiled wryly at the thought, recalling the faint scuff on the library floor, the shadow that had flitted through the moonlit corridor, and the enigmatic notes hidden in the study. Perhaps these seemingly trivial details were seeds for the next adventure, waiting patiently to bloom into intrigue. The quiet of the snow-filled evening offered space for reflection. Hodge and Boswell curled at her feet, observing her with their usual knowing expressions. Agatha absently stroked Hodge's head while she considered how quickly events had unfolded at Plover Hall, and how neatly yet imperfectly resolution had settled over the estate. There were victories, revelations, and humorous misjudgments, but mysteries never truly ended, did they? The letter hinted that curiosity, the very trait that had carried her through so many delicate situations, would soon be called upon again. She allowed herself a gentle chuckle, imagining the amused gasp of her acquaintances should they ever glimpse this new challenge in the making. The snow continued to fall, muffling sound and lending an almost magical serenity to the hall. Yet beneath that quiet charm, Agatha's mind was alert, cataloging possibilities, predicting subtle disturbances, and imagining the first moves of the unseen correspondent. Even in the calm, suspense lingered, delicate as frost on a garden gate. Tucking the letter carefully into her coat pocket, Agatha leaned back in her chair, sipping tea and glancing at the glowing hearth. The night outside was silent, comforting, and full of potential. She allowed herself to relax, knowing that Plover Hall had weathered its storm, yet ready for the next. A hint of intrigue, a whisper of challenge, and a dash of humor promised that adventure would arrive sooner than later. With a small, satisfied smile, she settled into the firelight, allowing both warmth and anticipation to envelop her, as the snow fell quietly, covering the world in cozy mystery once more.